everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Tinatin Japaridze, an analyst with Eurasia Group. Tinatin, thank you so much for coming back on.
Thank you so much for having me back, Brittany.
President Trump made some announcements regarding the Russia-Ukraine war this week, and I want to get into those because every couple of weeks you and I have a conversation and talk about the state of this conflict. And to remind our viewers, the last time you and I spoke was at the beginning of June, right after Operation Spider's Web, which was a complex drone attack executed by Ukraine that hit multiple military bases deep within Russia, destroying dozens of the country's aircraft and reportedly totaling billions of dollars in damage. Weeks later, before we get into the announcements, before we get into the U.S. position here, what is the state of the battlefield in this conflict?
So obviously we are seeing some Russian gains on the battlefield in terms of territory, but in terms of anything earth-shattering, it's very much, I would say, in a bit of a stalemate in terms of the progress that the Russian side is making. Also, Ukraine, as you and I have talked about this in the past, continues to unfortunately deal with its own manpower issues, the deficit that we've been observing for quite a while now. So the same challenges continue. And I think both Russia and Ukraine have been waiting for the United States, and specifically President Trump, to actually come out and, in many ways, I think, dictate how this trajectory in terms of the war and what's happening politically, and not just vis-a-vis the battlefield development, how that continues to develop going forward. Because, of course, the United States has a major say, because in many ways, the US has been responsible for a lot of the support that Ukraine has been getting in terms of weapons deliveries and so forth over the past few years. So many were watching Washington very closely to see whether or not we would see Donald Trump losing patience with President Putin, becoming more and more frustrated, because obviously the promise that President Trump had made coming back to the White House, and also the promise that he thought he had received in some way from his Russian counterpart, that was really not delivered. So we were all very interested to see whether or not that would mean that President Trump would essentially start getting tired of the back and forth with Moscow, and in some way start to rethink whether he should instead increase support for Ukraine, which I think is some of what we are observing already.
And I think something that you and I have talked about at length is the change in relationship between President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin, because President Trump was very complimentary of Putin at the beginning of this second term here. And the trajectory of where that relationship is right now is interesting. And President Trump said this earlier this week, quote, "My conversations with him, meeting Putin, are always very pleasant. I say, isn't that a very lovely conversation? And then missiles go off that night. I go home, I tell the First Lady, I spoke with Vladimir today. We had a wonderful conversation. She said, oh, really? Another city was just hit." Why do you think we're seeing this change in the relationship? Do you think it's because, based on that comment, it sounds like he feels that he's getting played by Putin?
I think so. And I think those around President Trump who may have been hinting this have been trying to convey essentially the same message, that it is very difficult, if not impossible, to trust Vladimir Putin. We know his track record all too well. We've been watching him for over 25 years now. So it's difficult to make a deal with someone who is not necessarily going to be acting on his own words. And of course, President Trump, even though he has some history with Putin and they have worked together in the past under his first presidency, nonetheless, he was still hoping that he would be able to get Putin to come to the table purely as an entrepreneur, to sort of give Putin something that he cannot refuse. From what I can gather, watching from this side of the Atlantic, I don't think that whatever offer, whatever tariffs were proposed to Vladimir Putin were sufficient for Putin. I think there may have been a momentum there when President Trump came back to the White House for Putin to essentially be given something that he would find very difficult to say no to. And that did not happen for whatever reason. It was not enough for Putin. He wanted more. Perhaps what he wanted was unrealistic, and Washington could not deliver that to Moscow. And therefore, what we're seeing now is that both the United States as well as Russia are starting to lose patience with the other a little bit. And that is very clear to me already, because obviously President Trump's rhetoric is changing, his whole stance toward the Kremlin is changing, the tone is not what it was, certainly. And all of this was triggered in many ways, I think, by this sort of growing personal frustration with Putin. And when we last connected, Brittany, President Trump was still speaking, as you said, rather glowingly of his Russian counterpart. But of course, as predicted, and I think we could have all anticipated this, one's patience has limits. And here the US president is going to be no exception to the rule. And this frustration is not just mounting with President Trump, but in Washington overall, because none of the promises that may have been made behind closed doors between Moscow and also, obviously, the White House has sort of been delivered upon by the Russian side. And they're continuing to say that they will come to the table with something. Also, Washington has sort of been telling us all publicly that there is a deal that is in the making, that it is imminent, but in reality, it is not a deal that is imminent. In fact, I would say that the deal is probably further away from being achieved than it was a few months ago, because it's very, very clear that Vladimir Putin is not ready to actually start negotiating. His hardline stance remains very hardline, and there isn't anything at the moment that will make him come to the table and agree to essentially concessions, which I think is what President Trump was hoping for.
And it seems like, to your point, President Trump's patience is wearing thin. And I'm curious if you think money and a financial squeeze will bring President Putin to the table, because President Trump threatened some pretty tough tariffs on Russia. He said that he's going to slap Russia with very severe tariffs at about 100% if a peace deal with Ukraine isn't reached in 50 days. And that threat was made on Monday. He also threatened secondary tariffs, and these were later explained as tariffs on countries like China, like India, that buy Russian oil. So do you think that's going to bring Putin to the table?
I don't think so, at least not for the time being, because in many ways, I think that the biggest risk here is sort of any disruption to global energy markets, right? And that is Putin's usually biggest fear. And that is that card that everybody tries to play vis-a-vis Russia when it comes to their energy. So in terms of any major disruptions, for the time being at least, we see that that's going to be unlikely. President Trump also has historically been quite reluctant to enact any policies that might spark substantial increases in global energy prices. So while sanctions against Russian energy will remain the primary economic tool, even moderate actions like adjusting the price cap on Russian oil exports will, for the time being, probably at least for the next 50 days, be sort of in place, on hold. But I think that it very much depends on what happens after the 50 days. I don't anticipate any miracles from the Russian side over the next 50 days. Although having said that, the 50-day deadline does strike me as overly generous, just given the fact that if Putin was going to come to the table with something, he probably would have done so by now.
Yeah, that is an interesting timeline, because President Trump, if we remember with the conflict with Iran, he gave Iran a few weeks or so, and then he struck just a few days later. Do you think that 50 days President Trump will realize, hey, maybe I was too generous with that, and back it up at all? Is there any chance of that?
He could. He could, because I think there's a chance that conversations will continue over the next few weeks between Moscow and Washington, off the record, probably behind closed doors. And if he gets any signals from Moscow that Putin is not going to budge today and he's not going to budge in 50 days, then he is likely to actually do something before then. I don't think that this is necessarily set in stone. I think he had to put a date on it just to show that he actually means it, and this is a real deadline. But there are no guarantees that President Trump is not going to do something prior to that as well, especially if the Russian side does not continue to just bomb cities across Ukraine, but actually increases its attacks. I mean, so far we're talking probably about critical infrastructure and so forth about in terms of the main targets. But even so, if there is something that President Trump sees from the other side that he really dislikes, and he realizes that he's being played in this respect in Moscow, then we cannot rule out that he may do something before the 50 days are up.
And in that same press conference, President Trump announced this sort of roundabout way to give Ukraine weapons. And it was that NATO allies are going to buy weapons from the United States, and then in turn, those countries are going to supply Ukraine with arms. What do you make of that plan?
Well, it's a plan that, first of all, the NATO countries and specifically a lot of the European allies have to agree to. And where we're seeing mixed messages coming out of Europe at the moment. And there is a little bit of consensus, but it's clear that Europe's response to the initiative is far from uniform so far, with each country weighing their own defense priorities and resources. So, for example, we've seen some media reports that France and Italy are not unlikely, that are actually unlikely to be joining the initiative. And France wants to prioritize its own defense industry, which makes sense. Italy has also cited funding issues reportedly and is supporting Ukraine in other ways, for example, providing air defense systems. The Czech Republic has also reportedly opted out. So, a lot of these countries will be weighing their options. I don't think anyone is going to come out today and say that this is their decision. There are countries that are likely to support this initiative. For example, Germany, the UK, Canada, the Netherlands, several Nordic countries. They're leaning toward backing the plan, but all of the details are still very much under discussion.
And so then my final question to you is, you always tell us what signposts to look out for next. Is the next signpost between 50 days from Monday and beyond for Russia to come to the table, for us to see if Russia makes a deal with Ukraine? What specifically are you looking out for next?
Well, it's inevitable that Russia is going to continue its military efforts in eastern Ukraine and maintain attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. But in terms of a broader escalation in response, for example, to this announcement from Washington, I think that's probably unlikely for the time being. But I would not expect over the near term any major concessions or meaningful shifts from Vladimir Putin toward a ceasefire. So instead, they will probably continue to keep some sort of diplomatic channel open, hoping that, I think the best case scenario for Moscow is that President Trump will lose focus on Ukraine. He will get distracted with something else somewhere else and essentially drop the ball. So I think that is the signpost that Russia is hoping for and crossing its fingers for. In terms of the Ukrainians, they're probably going to hope that they can deepen cooperation with the US, deepen the ties, deepen conversations also. Very different from what we saw in the Oval Office between President Trump and President Zelensky that you and I discussed. I think now we're seeing something drastically different. There will be a new ambassador coming to Washington from Ukraine soon. So with all of these changes, I think that the signpost will be whether or not this momentum between Kiev and Washington can be sustained, if not deepened. And at the same time, seeing what happens on the other side with the Russian side, because I'm not necessarily in this case watching the battlefield developments as closely for signposts per se. I think the summer will be quite stable. They will continue fighting, of course, because now is the season to fight. But it's really politics and diplomacy, and in some cases lack thereof, that is going to potentially make the difference. So let's see what happens with the plan that was proposed by President Trump to NATO allies. Let's see if the Europeans actually commit to this, which countries do commit, and what that looks like, and what that timeline looks like. Because it's one thing to commit to delivering weapons or buying weapons for Ukraine. But it's a whole other conversation in terms of how long that's going to take, in terms of practical steps. So all of the above, I think, will be important signposts, and just watching closely how this tone in Washington develops and whether we see any shifts, because I would not rule out that you and I will be sitting here, Brittany, in a few weeks' time and potentially seeing something very, very different in Washington in terms of the tone and the stance, because we've been there before and we've seen this happen before. So I guess your guess is as good as mine, but I'm going to be watching words and listening to words very carefully.
And then I know that I said that was my last question, but your response just prompted another one. Back in that infamous White House meeting between Zelensky and Trump, President Trump famously said to Zelensky, "You don't have the cards." As of right now, we're talking a lot about the United States. Does the United States hold all of the cards in this conflict? Who holds the most here, do you think?
Well, for different reasons, I would say that probably Russia and the United States hold the biggest amount, and in terms of the weight that these cards carry. That's one thing. But there's also, of course, Ukraine, because it is, after all, a war between Russia and Ukraine, and it's much closer to Europe than it is to the United States. So, of course, here Europe matters a great deal as well. It matters in terms of how much Europe is going to be able to get involved even more hands on in terms of supporting Ukraine. But for the time being, I think in terms of the cards, yes, of course, the US matters a great deal. A lot of countries, including European countries, look to the United States, and oftentimes they echo or try to emulate what the US does. So, in many ways, the US here is also going to be seen as one of the biggest decision makers in terms of diplomacy. But Russia, after all, matters probably to me the most, because in the end, it's going to have to be Russia that decides if and when they're going to come to the table with something substantial. So right now, they're making more gains than Ukraine is able to in terms of territorial gains on the battlefield. They are, after all, the ones who started the full scale invasion, who started the war against its neighbor, against Ukraine. So, in that respect, of course, Russia still matters the most. We can't wait, and we should not be waiting, and no one should, including Vladimir Putin, for Ukraine to capitulate. So, in that respect, if that is what the Vladimir Putin regime is hoping for, that one day President Zelensky will wake up and the Ukrainian people will capitulate, I don't think that is going to happen anytime soon. There may be some concessions here and there, but in terms of what those concessions look like, even there, I think Russia matters a lot more, because no matter what Ukraine gives to them, the sad reality is that even if they say yes to some of the concessions and some of the pressures from the Russian side, the biggest risk is that Vladimir Putin, given his track record, will always want more.
Well, there is certainly a lot to look out for, and I'm going to leave it there. But until next time, Tinatin Japaridze, thank you so much for joining me. I always learn so much from our conversations.
Thank you so much for having me back.